Okay, and supercalifragilisticexpialidocious something.
Wow, you don't even know it.
I don't know it. No, I don't. Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. Welcome to Geek Cross, the podcast where faith and culture intersect. I'm your host, Jeremy Yoder. In each episode, we look at a topic related to pop culture or geekdom and have conversations that use science fiction, fantasy, games, or comic books as a jumping off point to talk about deeper issues and to wrestle with the big questions of life. My guest today is Alison Kelley. Alison, welcome, and why don't you tell a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Jeremy. Thanks for having me. A little bit about myself. Well, I am married. I'm an attorney. I live in New York City, and I am your little sister.
That is the most important detail, right?
Definitely. It has certainly had a big effect on my life.
I'm sure it has. Well, why don't you, Alison, tell a little bit about how wonderful it was growing up as my little sister?
Well, there were times it was quite wonderful. I remember when I was upset, we would have burping contests. You would do that to help calm me down. But, I mean, we also fought a lot. I remember that, too. And, yeah, I guess overall you've been a really wonderful big brother.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, one of the memories that I have, and this gets to our topic for this podcast, is I remember you loving Mary Poppins, the movie Mary Poppins. And you used to stand in front of the television with an umbrella, and you would recite all the dialogue for several characters. You had it memorized, and you would act it out. It was very Rocky Horror Picture Show of you. So I wanted to have you on today to talk a little bit about what is it like to love something like that so much as a kid, and then to go and live life, and 20 years later you look at a film that you loved as a kid, and what is that experience like?
Yeah, well, I will say that when you mentioned to me that you wanted to have this podcast or do this podcast, I thought maybe I traumatized you a little bit more than I realized. So I really enjoyed Mary Poppins growing up. I remember really liking it. I do remember dancing and singing to it. But it never occurred to me that it had such a profound effect on you, I guess. Like, there's other movies or, like, books that I felt, like, a lot, maybe more attachment to because I listened to them or read them when I was older.
Uh-huh.
But the good thing about, what you're interested in talking about is that I probably haven't watched Mary Poppins in 20 years. So I have very, like, strong feelings about what it was like as, like, a 10-year-old to watch Mary Poppins. And I just watched it again today, and it was it was different than I expected.
So why don't we talk a little bit about, for the few people who have been living in Iraq and didn't watch Disney movies growing up, what is the story about? What's the movie about?
Sure. So Mary Poppins is about, the movie is about a family that's a mom and dad and 2 kids, and the parents are kind of self-involved. The father is very logical, works for a bank, cares a lot about order and precision and is everything being done right, no noise. Mother is kind of self-involved in her suffrage movement. She wants votes for women and is kind of just doesn't pay attention to things. So these kids are just kind of run wild, do their own thing. And Mary Poppins comes and takes them on all of these kind of magical adventures, such as, you can clean up your room by snapping your fingers, or if you laugh really hard, you end up on the ceiling, or you can spend the day in a chalk painting. So Mary Poppins is this kind of magical nanny that comes to live with them. Is that a fair representation?
I think it's a fair representation. And
okay.
And so, talk a little bit about what did you love so much about this as a little girl?
Well, I always loved things where I felt like I could put myself in them, so I really identified with the children, Jane and Michael, because I was they are probably, 6 and 7 or something in the movie. They're really pretty small. And I was probably the same age when I started watching it. So I think that was, for one thing, I felt like I could age-wise appreciate or put myself in there. The music is really great. I love the music. It's very catchy. I liked the magical feel of it.
Did you relate at all to the theme of the absentee parents?
Contrary to our mother's opinion, I don't think that's why I liked it. I don't think it was something where I was like, oh, my parents are absentee naming Mary Poppins will come and rescue me. Didn't feel that. I think I was more drawn to the, like, they were doing something really fun and really special, and I wanted to do something fun and be special.
I mean, I think that's one of the things that's so interesting about a lot of kids' stuff. It often has absentee parents. Parents who aren't really there, parents who aren't really paying attention to their kids. It's a common theme in children's literature and in children's movies. And I always kind of wondered, what is that about?
Well, I guess I see that too as being like something that's so fun about kids' books is that it gets into kids' minds. And to do that, you can't have the parents being like talking over them, telling them what to do, being super present. You need to have the kid kind of doing their own thing to really get into who the kid is and what they're thinking and how they see the world.
In other words, if the parents were present, they would be a distraction from the story.
Yeah, I think so, exactly.
Okay.
And leaving kids to their own devices also can create really interesting scenarios, I guess.
Right. It's just such a prevalent theme, and I've often sort of wondered what's going on. What is it about, the relationship between children and their parents, and the struggle that kids have when their parents don't have time for them, and are busy paying bills and going to jobs and doing other things. What causes that child and to grow up and write about that experience,
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I guess I don't know more than that kind of speculation that maybe it's just a good way to get those different scenarios that come up in children's books that wouldn't be possible if parents were constantly present.
Okay. All right. Moving on. So let's talk about today and your experience of watching this movie today after 20-something years.
Sure. Well, the first thing that struck me was that I never realized how gendered the movie is. It really plays on gender stereotypes in a way that I was almost uncomfortable, which really surprised me, because obviously nothing was new to me in the movie. But, the father comes in and he sings a song about how he just likes everything at exactly this time, and he's very logical and responsible and, like, knows, makes the decisions for the family. And then the mom is just, this flighty woman who just, oh yes, dear, you're so smart, dear, everything to her husband. And I was just very surprised by how strong that was.
Don't you think in some ways that the film kind of critiques that, though? I mean, it does kind of, like, that sort of represents a kind of early 20th century British society that, where the parents were the parents had nannies so they could go off and live their own lives. And I mean, you think the film critiques that or no?
Maybe. I guess I didn't gotten that far in thinking about it that way. I guess it could certainly take it that way because, I mean, the point is that the parents start paying attention more to their children. That's kind of the point in the movie. I guess I took a little bit of an exception to, like, the mom's, like, frivolous project was getting votes for women, like the right to vote for women. That to me was, I guess, upsetting. I don't know. This is something that I had never paid attention to before, and I was just like surprised by it.
Okay, what other surprises did you have?
Well, number one, how young Jane and Michael were, the kids. I just they were so little in the movie. I didn't remember them being so little. Also, there were just things I didn't understand, like the whole bank situation. So there's a scene in the movie where the kids go to the bank where their father works. The father brings them to work. And the boy, Michael, has some tuppence, and he wants to use it to buy some bread to feed the birds that are outside of his church. But the father is and the bankers are trying to teach Michael that he should invest it. And Michael refuses to give them the tuppence, and it ends up causing a run on the bank. And right. That was so over my head when I was a kid. I did not understand that at all.
So when you were a kid watching this, what do you think was happening?
I mean, I don't know. I guess this mean old man was trying to get Michael to give him his tuppence. I didn't understand everything else that was going on.
Yeah, that's kind of a social justice-y part of the film that's kind of surprising, actually.
Yeah, and it was, I really did not understand that's what happened. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anything else that surprised you about the movie?
I guess as far as in relation to when I watched it, there was some songs and stuff where I'd always thought the words were kind of mumbo jumbo, but in fact they were actually real words, meaning real things. So it's in my head.
Not supercalifragilisticexpialidocious.
No, obviously I know that it's mumbo jumbo. I mean, I don't even think I could tell you now what the songs were, but sometimes when you're little and you hear like a song and you don't understand what the words are because they don't say them clearly. You just kind of make up what that is, and it's like a mumbo jumbo word. And I guess I had done that, and then I realized what I was listening to today. Oh, that actually like means something.
Yeah. So how do you feel about the movie now that you've watched it again, and like, does it compare to what you thought about it as a kid? Do you like the movie still?
I mean, I like it for like nostalgia purposes. I mean, I have a real fondness for it. There's some really good songs in there and stuff. It was longer than I remember. Mm-hmm. It's probably not something I would sit down and watch on my own again. But, I mean, I'm sure if and when I have children, like, they will watch it and I will enjoy introducing them to the movie.
I've seen the film a number of times because I've got two small daughters who we expose to films like that. And, one thing that strikes me about, and Mary Poppins is not the only film, but like Disney films from the 60s, there is this zaniness to them, like especially once you get to the climax. Like in the case of Mary Poppins, it's the dancing chimney sweeps.
Chimneys, yeah.
And they have this huge, long, drawn-out musical dance sequence that they keep upping the absurdity of it. Like, the film, for the most part, has some anchoring in reality until that, even with, cartoon penguin waiters.
Yeah, I'm going to say, I don't think this is less realistic than the rest of the movie.
But, well, maybe it's not that. Maybe the film kind of walks this line. Okay, so maybe it's not that the film is realistic, it's just that there are parts of it that feel grounded in some sort of reality, and at that point, like the entire sequence with the run on the bank, which is something incredibly frightening and scary and very kind of real in terms, like, at that time, that was a real fear and a danger of the banking system, that they would not be able to pay out what they owed people, and they would close it. Mm-hmm. And it just kind of goes from there to a bunch of chimney sweeps dancing on the rooftop, and it just keeps upping it to the point where they're in the house dancing around, singing "Votes for Women," and it just is zany. It's just really absurd.
I will say, as a kid, I loved that scene so much. Like, I loved that they were like in the house dancing everywhere, making everything dirty. Like, the song was so fun. I wished I was there. I was jealous that I couldn't just like go up a chimney and dance on the rooftops with them. Like, I loved that as a kid.
So, as part of the preparation for this, we both have gone and read the book.
We did.
Which is the first time that either one of us has read the book. So, what'd you think of the book? How's the book different from the movie?
Well, I think I should preface this with a couple of things. First of all, the book I guess it's a series, and we only read the first book. And so,
right, correct.
I am speculating that there are parts of the other books that play into the movie that we did not read. That's
my assumption too, yeah.
Also, like, I a little bit feel reluctant to really pile on the book because I know sometimes people, if I had read this as a child, I might feel very differently about the book than I do as an adult. But I really didn't like it.
Really?
I mean, I think it was a lot darker than I anticipated. Mary Poppins is not nice.
No.
She is, Julie Andrews has a very cheery quality. Even though she's stern, she's very, like, easy to love.
It's a twinkle in her eye kind of sternness.
Yeah, exactly. And she smiles and stuff, too.
And it's Julie Andrews who,
Right, who's also very beautiful. Like, in the book, Mary Poppins is very vain, but she's not supposed to be pretty.
Right, exactly. And, yeah, she was such not a nice person in the book.
No. And there was one time in the movie where I felt like that came across. And that was as Mary Poppins is leaving. She's leaving, and the children are crying. And the children ask her, well, don't you love us? And she says, what would happen to me if I loved all the children I left? And I was like, what a cruel thing to tell children! And then I was like, that's kind of like the Mary Poppins of the book. So, yeah, what did you think about the book?
So I thought the book was actually really weird. In the sense that there's some very strange scenes. Like, for the first about third of the book, the movie follows pretty closely, right?
Right, like, stuff happens in the book that also happens in the movie. Right,
until the scene where they, are laughing and bouncing around the top of of the ceiling of the house.
Sure.
With Uncle Albert. Then it goes, the two diverge.
Yes.
And there's some very weird, unexplained stuff. Like, there's a chapter where Michael and Jane go to the zoo in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
And it keeps talking about some kind of birthday thing. And
it's Mary Poppins' birthday.
It's Mary Poppins' birthday, right.
On the full moon.
On the full moon. And because of that, the roles reverse with the animals and the people. And the people are in the cages, and the animals are out as the zookeepers and the public, and it is a very weird chapter.
Right, and the only reason that Michael and Jane are not behind in the cages is because they're friends with Mary Poppins, who is the great exception to, I guess, humankind.
Yes.
Yeah, and also there's never any, like, why is this happening? It's just, yeah, it was so dark. I think I would have been terrified reading that as a kid.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there are parts of the book that don't really feel suitable to kids. But, you know, the edition that I read had a speech from P.L. Travers where she talked about that she did not consider herself to be a children's author, and that she was not writing for children, and that she objected to this idea of dividing up children's books according to age, because how do you know that kids are ready for reading certain books? So I think a big part of the book is that she did not understand herself as a quote-unquote children's writer. And so I don't think felt the need to keep herself bound to sort of writing a book that was safe and pleasant and the kinds of things that people thought children should read. From what I've read, she was a very cranky kind of person, you know, and I think the book reflects that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think a good way to describe this book, it doesn't really have a sense of humor, which is surprising for, like, the things that it covers. Such as, you know, if you laugh really hard, you end up on the ceiling, or there's, like, a cow that can't stop dancing, and so the cow has to jump over the moon in order to be able to stop dancing. It just doesn't have, I guess the movie feels like it has a real sense of humor to it, and maybe it's that twinkle in her eye, which doesn't exist in the book, but yeah, that is lacking in the book, I would say.
Yeah. But I think what I liked about it is that I think for children, childhood feels dangerous. And it does feel dark and kind of threatening. And I kind of like a fantasy or magic which has an edge to it. Where there is something about it that feels dangerous. And it's not just simply exciting or good. That there is something to it that feels like it could get out of control or somebody could get hurt. I kind of like that edge to it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I did read that she said that one time that she felt like kids weren't given enough credit for what they can understand and what they can handle. And I think that's probably true, that kids probably can read more kind of serious or, as you say, scary stories than we maybe often expose them to. Is an interesting take on how to write a children's book.
Well, one of the points that she made in this speech was that the fairy tales did not originate as children's stories. They were originally folk tales that people just told each other. And then in the 19th century, they were collected by collectors like the Grimm brothers. And then, after it was put together into a book and written down, then they became children's stories. But originally, they weren't. And, you know, if you read the Brothers Grimm, there's some really, really dark stories in there that you're like, how is this supposed to be for kids? You know, there's a lot of violence and decapitation and that kind of stuff.
Sure. So that's an interesting point. So, because I read too a lot about P.L. Travers' problems with Disney. Disney was making the movie, and she only sold their rights to the movie because she, I think, was needing money. And she took real issue with how they were making things happier and were making, you know, Mary Poppins pretty and likable. And I find that to be like an interesting comparison then to the fairy tales, that like stories go through this kind of revolution or evolution rather to become children's stories. That Mary Poppins seems to kind of done something similar. Maybe less drastic, but similar.
Well, I've been thinking about it. A lot of, you know, young adult fiction or children's fiction is actually really dark. I mean, I'm thinking of Harry Potter. You know, the books start out really kind of light-ish. I mean, there are sort of these dark undertones. You know, Harry Potter is an orphan. Voldemort is this threat, but they're relatively light. The films actually are even lighter. The Chris Columbus films, you know, those are actually a lot more happy than the books are. And as the series goes on, it becomes darker and there are real costs there. People die. People don't survive. And that's pretty dark for young adult fiction. And so I think it's always kind of an undercurrent And I think there's a tension there because there are, on the one hand, demand for happy stories for children because we, the adults, are uncomfortable with darkness for our kids. But yet I think kids like dark stories.
Yeah.
I think it reflects their reality and what they experience.
Well, and I wonder too if maybe some of that is that. So, a lot of good children's stories or good children's movies are ones where when you watch it as an adult, there's layers there that you didn't get as a child. And sometimes I guess I wonder when you're saying that, maybe it also, though, like these stories have those undertones because we as adults enjoy them more. I mean, you have children. How many children's programs have you watched that don't have those darker undertones that are incredibly boring and annoying?
Well, yeah, I mean, you get stuck with the Teletubbies then.
Right, so maybe some of it too is that just the adults like the dark undertones.
Well, a lot of kids' movies always have something in there for the parents. Something there for, some humor in there that is so that goes above the kid's head that is not really kid-friendly humor.
Right.
Because they know that, the parents are in the theater there, and they have to entertain them too.
Sure.
I mean, I've been trying to think about, Winnie the Pooh, the books there are relatively happy. But then they also have social commentary in them as well. I get the sense that books are poking fun at certain kinds of people and in the sort of seriousness of Al, for example. I think really good children's books operate on a number of levels and have layers to them that we don't really think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
So how do you think that the kinds of stories that you paid attention to as a kid, that you watched movies of, how do you feel like they impact you today? Or don't they at all?
Oh, wow. That's a hard question. So I'm trying to think of, aside from Mary Poppins, movies and books that I really feel like had an impact on me were The Sound of Music, which I also dressed up to and danced and sang to.
I remember.
Anna of Green Gables series, both the movies and the books. I was very into that for a long time.
Yeah.
And then you and I used to watch a lot of Disney movies when we were growing up. But we watched, Robin Hood and Aladdin and Little Mermaid.
Right. We were the right age, right around the time that the Disney cartoons really hit big again.
Yeah, and I remember we had a couple summers where we went pretty hardcore on those movies, watched them a lot.
Mm-hmm. I remember that. Yeah. So how do you think they've impacted you?
That was me stalling because I'm not sure. Why don't you say? How do you think they've impacted you?
Well, I think I have this love for stories, and I think I think they had impact there. I think in some cases I've gone beyond the Disney movie, and I've tried to go to the original sources and read, some of the Grimm's tales without the Disney influence in it, and yeah, I think about those kinds of stories, and I try to figure out what's the meaning behind them, and what do they tell us about what it means to live, and that's one of the reasons why I do this podcast, because I'm asked those kinds of questions, and it's an opportunity to kind of engage in that. But, I was really interested in Greek myths when I was in middle school. And, yeah, I just think that I have this interest in stories in part. I mean, we were also a family that told a lot of stories, too. Right. At least Dad told me a lot of stories. And so, I think I have this fascination with storytelling, with stories, because of those influences,
Interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't say that that has happened to me. I do think that those sorts of movies and books really allowed me to have a really active imagination growing up. And I feel like that has turned into something that makes me want to be more adventurous, I guess. Makes me want to experience things. And I love to read, and I love reading different things and different types of books. And I do think some of that comes just from watching movies and reading books as a child, where you are transported into a different world, be it a magical one or, one that's just, in the past. That is something I still really appreciate, is being able to read about different places and trying to go experience those different places when I can. I think it's had less of an effect for me as far as just the art of storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I find also as a parent, I'm coming back to these kinds of things much more. I remember a while back I showed the girls the Douglas Fairbanks version of The Thief of Baghdad, which would have been the silent movie from the 20s. And they were fascinated with it, even though there was no audio to it. I find that I'm introducing my girls to these kinds of stories. Over the last couple of days, we watched Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. And both girls, and one's 6, one's 3, really latched on to those stories. There's something there that they're connecting with on a pretty profound level. The youngest one is able to identify the good guys and the bad guys and really love the robots. And the older one, the 6-year-old, well, first of all, loves Princess Leia, but people started asking questions about, well, why did Luke Skywalker's dad become bad, and why did he then save his life? And sort of moral reasoning,
Wow.
through the story. And before we did that, and a couple of years ago, I remember we would be doing fairy tales, and I remember reading her Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And my daughter felt so bad about what had happened, how Goldilocks had violated the bear's property,
I love that.
that she would pretend, we have to act out her as Goldilocks coming back and saying that she was sorry.
Oh my goodness.
And fixing the chairs and making more porridge, and she would act that out.
Oh, bless her.
or one time she asked me with Hansel and Gretel, she asked, well, why did the parents send the kids out into the woods? And I said, well, they didn't have enough food. The stepmother wanted them out because she didn't have enough food. And she asked, well, maybe Hansel and Gretel could find food and bring it back, and then they wouldn't have to leave. And
Aww.
I had sort of assumed that the stepmother was irredeemable.
Right.
And my oldest daughter didn't see it that way. She ended up having this moral imagination that was much bigger than how I had thought and understood the story. And so I think storytelling and the kinds of stories that we tell that are deeply connected to mythology and folklore and fairy tales and, even Bible stories, I think give kids space sometimes. It depends entirely on how we tell the story. It gives the kids space to figure out how the world works and to respond with, well, that doesn't make any sense. What is this other possibility?
That's so interesting. I guess I feel like you talking about your oldest daughter's reaction to some of the fairy tales, I do distinctly remember having, and I still feel like I sometimes struggle with this, like too much empathy with characters. Like I remember at the end of The Little Mermaid, it's like really happy. She's marrying the prince. And I would be really upset because she would have to leave her friends and family. Mm-hmm. And it was like a choice she had to make to leave everyone that she knew. And then I felt really bad for her sisters and her dad when she left. And I think I still kind of struggle with that sort of intense empathy for characters, or now it's translated into sports. So, for example, March Madness recently happened, and it's really hard for me to see the teams after they lose when they're
Seriously?
really disappointed. Yeah,
Seriously?
This is serious. You can just ask my husband. He's a little ashamed of me. No, it is. I just feel so badly for them. But I do think it comes from the same place as feeling bad for characters and in the children's stories that I would read when I was growing up.
Where I see it for myself is I have a really hard time with awkward humor. Where a character in a comedy is going through a really awkward kind of embarrassing kind of thing. Because I have empathy for this poor person, and I feel it too. And so it's not funny. It's just painful.
Oh, Jerry.
So I really don't do well with awkward humor.
Interesting. Yeah, that doesn't bother me as much as... And honestly, stories are not a problem anymore the way they were. I don't hurt for the characters in the same way I did when I was growing up. But seeing people be really upset or disappointed about something, even if it's just a sports game, is really hard for me when I know it's really happening. I think when I was growing up, it was a lot harder for me to separate kind of reality from what was not reality.
Yeah, and I think some people do that better than others. I mean, my eldest daughter has always done a good job separating those things. We could show her movies that are a little bit maybe too old for her, but she handles it really well because she can separate it. I can count on one hand the times that she's been freaked out by movies.
Uh-huh. I feel like she can watch movies that I can't.
Right, yeah.
She's 6.
She's 6. The younger daughter, a little while back we watched Jumanji, which is actually a pretty
scary.
Decent movie, but really intense. And she sat the entire time on the chair and just did not move.
Yeah.
And she was pretty freaked out about that. And so we've had to have conversations about, she doesn't like bad movies and she doesn't like scary movies. And so we've had to be a lot more careful with her about what she'll watch because she can't sort of handle it. She doesn't have that ability to separate it as my eldest daughter does.
Yeah, she's a girl after my own heart.
Yeah. I guess the question I want to ask this experience of going back and watching Mary Poppins after 20 years, is that something you like to do otherwise as well? Are there other things that you loved as a kid that you might want to explore again to see if it's something worth watching, or are you a little afraid to and you'd rather have the nostalgia?
Honestly, I think Mary Poppins was a pretty singular experience where that could happen. Because, number one, it is a movie that I knew really well growing up. And even now, like, I knew a bunch of the dialogue, I knew most of the songs, even though there were a couple things that I'd forgotten. I think any other movie that I would have known that well, I have seen since then.
So, like Sound of Music?
Yes, like, I have seen The Sound of Music since I was little. And I have seen and reread Anne of Green Gables. And I feel like this is actually, like, a very kind of singular experience. Because I had seen maybe little snippets of it, but I just hadn't seen it at all, really, in the past, 20 years or so. So I'm not even sure I could replicate the experience if I wanted to.
Sure. Is there anything you learned about yourself in this?
I felt like I was looking at myself as a little kid. I don't know that I learned much about myself, but I feel like I could see what I might have been. I felt like I was looking at myself from outside of my body, as a child. Does that make sense? I was looking
like you were watching yourself as a kid dance around with the umbrella.
Yeah. I felt like I could remember how I felt watching the movie, which I feel like you can't do because you've kind of seen it occasionally or something like that, and so you grow along with watching the movie. But in this case, I felt like I had the same feelings, the same reactions to certain characters, really, really disliking the men at the bank. That was a very strong feeling that I had as a child that I think I wouldn't have if I had repeatedly seen the movie since then.
I mean, that's a really interesting thing because, in a lot of cases, we do kind of grow up with certain movies and certain stories. And so, as we grow up with them and as we change, our relationship changes. And it must be really strange to go back to something that you have had no relationship with, really, since becoming an adult.
Yeah, and I think a good example of that is in The Sound of Music. There's 7 children. And when I started watching it, I was probably about the age of the youngest child, which is 5. And I remember, I would be oh, well, I'm the youngest child here. And then as I kept watching the movie, I would put myself into the child that was my age. And I would distinctly remember, going up in age with the children. So I was reliving that movie kind of over and over and over again. And I remember, I guess, changing my view of it. And so I think, the experience would not be the same as it was with Mary Poppins.
And that's a thing that's sort of unique about film, because film, it's an image that's been kind of frozen in time. We change, but Julie Andrews and Mary Poppins never changes. Yeah. It's exactly the same Mary Poppins that it was that we saw as kids. And yet we're different and we've grown and it means something. We're seeing different things in it than before. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it's a good thing. I think it is a way to help understand yourself better and to help understand children better. I do think this experience makes me, gives me a little window on what it was like to be a 6-year-old. Because you forget. Mm-hmm. And it's a good reminder.
Well, I think that's a great place to end. So thank you, Alison, for coming on, and we'll talk later again.
All right. Thanks, Jeremy.
If you like Geek Cross, please help us out and leave us a review on iTunes. You can find Geek Cross on Facebook and Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @GeekCrossShow. You can email us at geekcrossshow@gmail.com. Geek Cross is a McLaren production. My name is Jeremy Yoder. Thanks for listening.